Well, I am here with Melinda Deslatte, Research Director at PAR. Now, Melinda, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. We are going to talk about this new proposed budget from the governor. Now, some are saying that it's sort of a standstill budget. Talk to us about that.
I think generally that's how it's being presented by the Landry administration, as largely standstill. Year over year, there are some changes, obviously. But I would say the reason they call it a standstill is they don't have a ton of new state general fund money to spend. That's the flexible tax and fee revenue that the state gets. And they are keeping most agencies largely where they are in the current year. That's what they would be proposed to get next year. But there are some exceptions in education, economic development, juvenile justice, some of those kind of areas where there will be places that get more funding or get less.
Okay, and so what are some of the major changes that we'll see, some of the things that are going to get more funding and those that aren't?
So the governor has placed a priority on increasing some funding in the Department of Economic Development for marketing and business recruitment efforts. So that's an area of a little bit of new spending. There's some additional money in juvenile justice to try and create more bed space for youth offenders. And then education is probably the piece that most people will notice or will be talking about, which is the governor does not have money to continue the current $2,000 pay stipend that public school teachers have been getting, or the $1,000 pay stipend that school support workers have been getting. Now, arguably, that's because there's a constitutional amendment on the ballot in March that would provide funding for those stipends to become permanent, but that's a big question mark. Instead, he is proposing $50 million in new funding for a voucher program known as LA Gator. It would expand a voucher program that we've had on the books for a while. Essentially, it would let parents use public tax dollars to pay for private school tuition and other private school expenses, some homeschool expenses, things that are outside of the public school system. So that's sort of the area where he's proposed the most new funding, and it wouldn't be standstill.
Okay, all right. Now, something that I've seen from critics, and they're talking about they didn't see the domestic violence shelter funding in the proposed budget, but since then I do believe that the governor has addressed that. What are your thoughts on that? What was going on there?
So there has been like a flat funding formula of how domestic violence programs and shelters have been funded, and for the last couple years the legislature has inserted money above and beyond that funding formula, and the governor did not propose to continue that above and beyond funding, which I think is about $7 million a year. But domestic violence advocacy groups have used that funding to expand shelter beds, to help women who are in domestic violence situations. And so there was a lot of pushback immediately when it was understood that the governor's budget didn't include that additional funding that had been given to them for the past couple of years. So the governor has come out publicly and said he intends to find that funding in some sort of way and work with the legislature to make sure that it's maintained in the budget long term. So we will see. I think lots of people will be watching for that one in particular.
Now, in your expert opinion, in your expert understanding, I'll say it that way, what's your overall analysis of this new budget?
I think the biggest thing about this year's budget discussion is the uncertainty around it. Like we discussed, the governor's budget largely keeps a lot of agencies at a standstill, even though a lot of agencies have asked for additional funding for various things. We don't know several pieces of the funding picture writ large. There is a constitutional amendment on the ballot on March 29th that, if it passed, would rewrite the budget and tax section of the Constitution, and inevitably it would give the legislature more money to spend. Some of the changes that are included in that would give the legislature additional funding. It would also provide money for teacher pay. So that's a big question. They just had a special session on taxes where they rewrote large sections of the tax system for the state. They have estimated it as best they could for the income forecast for the state, but it's going to take a little while for that to shake out and to know if those numbers are close to accurate, if they need to adjust the forecast. And then over and above all of this, there is the question about federal funding from Washington. So Louisiana's budget, half of it is federally financed. That includes the federal funding for the Medicaid program. There are federal funds for disaster recovery. There are federal funds that go through education. We have federal funding all over our budget, and obviously The White House has ratcheted back some of the federal funding sources. Congress is talking about perhaps cutting some of the federal funding that is going to states. So there's just a lot of uncertainty, none of which is necessarily the fault of anybody in Louisiana, but there are lots of questions about what comes next. And I think as the legislature tries to craft a budget, they're going to have to work through all those different pieces and parts.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you as always for coming in and shedding some light on these very important topics. Thank you for all the work that you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you.